A shepherd limps out of the wilderness, his weathered face etched with fear. Chief Ranger Daniel Morgan has seen plenty in his 30 years of service, but never a man so terrified. "They're under the ice," the shepherd whispers, clutching Daniel's sleeve with trembling fingers. "My sheep and something else." Against protocol, Daniel follows the man's trail through pristine snowfields to a remote mountain lake. The ice is clear as glass, revealing not only a dozen frozen sheep, but stone walls, arched doorways, and ornate carvings of a civilization that shouldn't exist. What ancient power waits beneath that frozen surface, and why has it chosen now to reveal itself? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Daniel Morgan removed his hat and massaged his temples. 30 years in the Blackridge National Forest had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now every one of them screamed trouble. He glanced at the old leather journal on his desk, a record of his service, filled with the kind of observations that never made it into official reports. Snow fell outside his cabin window, fat flakes illuminated by the amber glow of his desk lamp. The calendar on the wall was marked with a red circle, just 43 days until retirement, a retirement he'd earned after 3 decades of solitude, sacrifice, and service. "Chief Morgan?" a voice called from the doorway, followed by a tentative knock. "Come in, Jesse," Daniel said, recognizing the voice of his young deputy. Jessica Reeves entered, brushing snow from her uniform. At 26, she represented everything the Park Service wanted: educated, enthusiastic, and equipped with all the latest training and technology. She would likely take his position after he left. "You've got to see this," she said, handing him a digital tablet. "Those hikers at Grizzly Point captured it this morning." Daniel squinted at the screen, adjusting his reading glasses. The video showed a man, the same shepherd from earlier, wandering through the snow, disoriented and limping heavily. "He came to the visitor center about an hour ago," Jesse continued. "Medical checked him out. Mild hypothermia, exhaustion, but otherwise." "Okay." "Says his name is Elias Thorne." "Thorne?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "From the old sheep ranch on the eastern boundary?" "Yes, sir. The family's been there for generations." She paused. "He's saying some pretty strange things, rambling about something. Under a lake. Superintendent Phillips thinks he's just delirious, wants to send him to county hospital for psychiatric evaluation." Daniel closed his journal and stood up. At 58, his joints protested more than they used to, especially in winter. His 6-foot frame remained imposing, though silver had long since replaced the dark brown of his hair and beard. "Where is he now?" "Break room. We gave him coffee and a blanket." "Sir, there's something else." She hesitated. "He asked for you specifically. Said you'd understand." Daniel's brow furrowed. He'd never met Elias Thorne, though the family name was well known locally. The Thornes kept to themselves, running sheep on the borderlands between national forest and private property. They were good stewards of the land, never had problems with them. "I'll talk to him," Daniel said, reaching for his uniform jacket. "Superintendent Phillips won't like it. He wants this wrapped up quickly. The media workshop starts tomorrow, and he doesn't want any distractions." Daniel resisted the urge to roll his eyes. The superintendent was more politician than ranger these days, always worried about publicity and budget meetings. 20 years ago, when Daniel had first become chief ranger, the focus had been on conservation and protection. Now it was all about visitor experience and social media presence. "Phillips can take it up with me if he has concerns," Daniel said, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. The break room was warm, smelling of coffee and the sandwich platters left from the afternoon staff meeting. Elias Thorne sat, hunched at the table, bony hands wrapped around a steaming mug. A woolen blanket draped his shoulders. He looked up when Daniel entered. "Chief Ranger Morgan," he said, his voice stronger than it had been at the lake. "Thank you for coming." Daniel nodded to the two rangers standing nearby. "Give us the room, please." When they were alone, Daniel sat across from Elias. Up close, he could see the man was older than he'd first thought, well into his 70s, with deep lines etched into sun-weathered skin. His eyes, however, were sharp and clear. "You saw it," Elias said, "not a question." "I saw something," Daniel admitted. "Buildings under the ice, and your sheep." Relief washed over the old shepherd's face. "They didn't believe me, the young ones. Never do." "Tell me what happened, Mr. Thorne." "Elias, please." He set down his coffee cup with a slightly trembling hand. "I was looking for strays. Had a dozen head wander off in the storm 3 days back, tracked them to that high valley, the one locals call Widow's Bowl." Daniel nodded. He knew it. A remote glacial cirque about 15 miles from the eastern boundary, accessible only by a difficult trail that was rarely used, even in summer. Found them at the lake edge, acting strange. Wouldn't respond to my calls or the dogs. Elias shook his head. Then, the ice. It cleared, like a window being wiped. And there it was, clear as day, the village. "The one from my grandfather's stories." Daniel leaned forward. "What stories?" "The drowned settlement, the place that had to be buried." Elias lowered his voice. "The place my family has been watching for generations." The door opened, and Superintendent Phillips entered, his polished appearance at odds with the rustic break room. "Chief Morgan, a word." Daniel stood, placing a reassuring hand on Elias's shoulder. "I'll be right back." In the hallway, Phillips didn't bother hiding his annoyance. "What exactly are you doing? We have the governor's office coming tomorrow, along with 3 major outdoor magazines." "I'm doing my job," Daniel replied evenly. "There's something at Widow's Bowl that needs investigation. A confused old man who lost some sheep. That's hardly a priority. I saw something under the ice, something that shouldn't be there." Phillips sighed. "Daniel, you've been an excellent ranger, but you're a month from retirement. Don't go chasing ghost stories now." "With respect, sir, until I turn in my badge, this forest and everything in it is my responsibility." The superintendent studied him for a moment. "Fine, file your report, but keep it quiet and be back for the media tour tomorrow afternoon." Daniel nodded, though they both knew he had no intention of rushing this investigation. When he returned to the break room, Elias was standing, leaning on an ornately carved walking stick that Daniel hadn't noticed before. The wood was polished from years of handling, with strange symbols etched along its length. "You believe me," Elias said. "I believe there's something at that lake worth investigating," Daniel replied carefully. "And I think you know more than you're telling me." A ghost of a smile crossed the old man's face. "Smart, like they said you'd be." He gripped his staff tighter. "We need to go back there, soon, before it's too late." "Too late for what?" Elias looked him directly in the eyes. "Before what's under the ice wakes up completely." Morning light filtered through heavy clouds as Daniel guided his Forest Service SUV along the narrow access road. Beside him, Elias Thorne sat quietly, one hand resting on his carved staff, the other absently touching the silver pendant hanging from his neck. The antique piece caught Daniel's attention, a circular medallion depicting what appeared to be a mountain lake surrounded by unusual markings. "Family heirloom?" Daniel asked, breaking the silence. Elias's weathered fingers closed around the pendant. 7 generations of Thorns have worn this. A reminder of our obligation, which is to warn. Elias looked out the window at the snow-covered pines. "My great-great-grandfather Ezekiel was the first. He was just a boy when his family settled here in 1862. Story goes he was hunting when he found the lake, saw things in the water that no white man had seen before. Daniel navigated around a fallen branch. Indigenous peoples would have known about it long before then." "Yes," Elias nodded. "The Blackfoot avoided it, called it the place where shadows walk. Ezekiel didn't know better, brought others. They wanted to drain the lake, build there." He shook his head. "That winter, 6 men died. Accidents, they said. But Ezekiel knew. The road ended at a small clearing that served as a maintenance area during summer months. Now it was blanketed in 2 feet of undisturbed snow. Daniel parked and checked his watch. "We're meeting a few people here," he explained. "If we're going back to Widow's Bowl, we need expertise." Elias frowned. "More people means more danger. More people means a better chance of understanding what we're dealing with," Daniel countered. "These are good people, professionals." The old shepherd looked unconvinced, but said nothing more. 20 minutes later, a university-marked SUV pulled into the clearing, followed by another Forest Service vehicle. Dr. Sarah Chen was the first to approach, extending a gloved hand to Daniel before her eyes settled curiously on Elias. "Daniel," she greeted warmly. "It's been a while." 4 years, he confirmed. "The petroglyphs at Eagle Canyon." Sarah nodded, her breath fogging in the cold air. At 52, she remained striking, her black hair now streaked with silver, her movements deliberate and graceful. As a leading archaeologist specializing in pre-Columbian settlements, she'd consulted on several projects within the national forest. "Your message was intriguing," she said. "Underwater ruins? That's what we need to confirm," Daniel replied, then introduced Elias. The ranger from the second vehicle approached next. Marcus Webb had worked in Blackridge for 15 years. His father was Blackfoot, his mother Swedish, giving him a unique perspective on the land and its history. "Chief?" Marcus nodded respectfully, then turned to Elias. "Mr. Thorne, I know your family by reputation. My grandfather spoke of your father once, said he was a man who respected the old ways." Something shifted in Elias's demeanor. "Respect is necessary when you live alongside things you don't understand." As the group began unloading equipment, a final vehicle approached, a rental car that parked at the clearing's edge. The woman who emerged was in her late 20s, with Daniel's strong jawline but softer features. She pulled a heavy backpack from the trunk and approached the group with a scientist's assessing gaze. "Dr. Chen, good to see you again," she said, then turned to Daniel with a more reserved expression. "Dad, Emily," Daniel replied, surprise evident in his voice. "I didn't expect you until next week." Finished at the Alaska site early, she adjusted her glasses. "When Dr. Chen called about this discovery, I thought my glaciology expertise might be useful." The unspoken message was clear. She was here for the science, not for his retirement ceremony. Elias watched this exchange with interest, his gaze moving between father and daughter. "You didn't tell me your child was coming?" "I didn't know," Daniel admitted, "but Emily's one of the best in her field. If there's something unusual about this lake, she'll figure it out." Emily acknowledged this with a nod, already transitioning to professional mode. "So, Mr. Thorne, tell me about this lake. Any unusual ice formations, discoloration, methane bubbles?" The old shepherd regarded her carefully. "You think like your father, practical, looking for natural explanations." He turned to address the entire group. "What lies beneath that ice has slept for centuries. My family's duty was to ensure it stayed that way. But something's changed. The ice has never been this clear, not in any record kept by my ancestors." "Why didn't your family report this site before?" Sarah asked. "If there are genuine archaeological remains, because some things are meant to stay buried," Elias interrupted. "My grandfather used to say, not all history deserves remembering." Marcus exchanged a glance with Daniel. "That aligns with some of our tribal oral histories. There are places in these mountains considered doorways to other worlds, places where the membrane is thin." Sarah began to object, but Daniel raised a hand. "Let's save the theories until we've seen it for ourselves. It's a 5-hour hike in these conditions, and daylight's limited." As the group shouldered their packs, Elias approached Daniel privately. "Your daughter," he said quietly. "She has your stubbornness, but not your instincts. Not yet. She trusts instruments and data, not the wisdom of experience." Daniel watched Emily efficiently organizing her scientific equipment. She's brilliant, Princeton undergrad, PhD from MIT. She just sees the world differently than I do. And that distance between you? Elias asked. Is it just about seeing the world differently? Daniel's jaw tightened. We should get moving. Elias nodded, understanding the boundary. He adjusted his pack and began walking, his limp pronounced but his pace steady. The carved walking staff left unusual impressions in the snow, the etched symbols seeming to momentarily shimmer before being covered by fresh powder. As they entered the tree line, Elias glanced back at the group following him. The Thorn family has guided many to the lake over generations, he murmured. Few have returned unchanged. The group moved in single file through the pristine forest. Snow crunched beneath their boots, and their breath clouded in the crisp air. Daniel took the rear position, watching the members of his hastily assembled team with a ranger's assessing eye. Sarah Chen paused occasionally to consult a topographic map she'd pulled from her pack. Not a standard Forest Service issue, but something more detailed. Daniel noticed unusual markings on it, elevation lines that didn't match any natural formation he knew in the region. That's not one of our survey maps, he commented, coming alongside her during a brief rest. Sarah tucked a strand of silver-streaked hair behind her ear. It's from a private collection, early 1900s geological survey, but never officially published. She traced a finger along an unusual depression. See this? The cartographer marked it as anomalous terrain feature rather than a natural lake basin. Where did you get it? Remember Professor Harrington? Before he retired, he gave me access to his archive of rejected survey documents, maps that were deemed inaccurate or unreliable. She folded the map carefully. When you mentioned widows, I remembered this. Ahead of them, Emily was engaged in conversation with Marcus, their voices low but animated. Daniel couldn't hear the words, but he recognized his daughter's passionate gestures, the same ones she'd used as a child when arguing a point. You two haven't spoken much, Sarah observed, nodding toward Emily. Daniel adjusted his pack straps. We haven't spoken much in 4 years, since Kathleen's funeral. Since I missed Kathleen's funeral, he corrected, because of the Elk Creek fire evacuation. Sarah's expression softened. You couldn't leave in the middle of an emergency evacuation, Daniel. I'm sure Emily understands that. Rationally. Rationally, maybe. But when your mother dies, and your father isn't there, he shook his head. Some wounds don't heal with rational thinking. At the front of the line, Elias stopped abruptly, leaning heavily on his carved staff. Marcus hurried forward to check on him. Need a break, Mr. Thorn. The old shepherd shook his head. Just listening. He closed his eyes, face tilted slightly as if catching a distant sound on the wind. Emily approached, scientific curiosity evident. What do you hear? Nothing, Elias answered, opening his eyes. That's the problem. No birds, no squirrels. Even the wind sounds wrong. He gestured toward a ridge ahead. We're getting close. Daniel moved forward, addressing the group. Let's take 15 minutes. Hydrate, check equipment. Once we cross that ridge, we'll be in the cirque, and it's exposed terrain. As the others set down their packs, Daniel approached Emily, who was checking a handheld atmospheric monitoring device. So, he began awkwardly, Alaska. How was it? Emily's eyes remained on her equipment. Cold. Informative. We're seeing unprecedented melt rates in previously stable formations. I read your paper in Earth Science Quarterly, the one about isotope dating in deep ice cores. She looked up, surprise momentarily replacing her professional distance. You read my paper? Of course I did. I read all of them. A complex emotion crossed her face before she tucked it away. Well, thank you. That particular methodology is still controversial in the field, but the data supports... She stopped herself. You don't need the technical details. I might understand more than you think, he said quietly. Emily sighed, setting down her device. Dad, why are we really here? A mysterious underwater village that no one's documented before? It sounds like One of your mother's stories, he finished when she hesitated. Kathleen Morgan had been a folklorist, specializing in frontier mythology. Her work had often intersected with Daniel's, turning ranger observations into academic papers about how wilderness shaped American storytelling. Mum would have loved this, Emily admitted, a brief vulnerability showing through. Racing to a hidden lake based on an old shepherd's tale. She would have been the first one on the trail, Daniel agreed, the shared memory creating a momentary bridge between them. The moment was interrupted as Marcus called out, "Chief, you should see this." The ranger had wandered about 50 yards off the main trail and was kneeling beside a weathered stone marker half buried in snow. Daniel and the others gathered around as Marcus brushed away the white powder, revealing carved symbols similar to those on Elias's walking staff. "It's a trail marker," Elias confirmed. "My ancestors placed them, warnings really." Sarah took photographs, her archaeological training evident in her methodical documentation. "These resemble pre-Columbian designs, but with distinctive variations I haven't seen before, because they're not from any tribe you've studied," Marcus said quietly. "These symbols belong to the people my grandfather called the First Ones, beings who were here before humans." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "That's a significant claim, Marcus." "I know how it sounds," he replied evenly, "but these symbols appear in our most restricted oral traditions, stories only told to certain family lines." "And you believe these stories?" Emily asked, her scientific skepticism evident. Marcus met her gaze. "I believe there are things in these mountains that deserve respect. Whether you call it cultural tradition or something else doesn't change. The fact that every indigenous group in this region has taboos about certain places," he nodded toward the ridge ahead, "including the place we're heading." Elias had been silent during this exchange, but now he pulled something from around his neck, the silver pendant Daniel had noticed earlier. He placed it beside the stone marker, and the similarity in the designs was unmistakable. "7 generations," he said. "That's how long my family has carried this burden. We are not the first watchers, and if we fail, we won't be the last." "Fail? At what exactly?" Emily asked. "Keeping it contained," Elias replied. "The thing beneath the ice." An uncomfortable silence fell over the group, broken finally by Daniel. "We should keep moving if we want to reach the lake before sunset." As they resumed their journey, Sarah fell into step beside Daniel. "I've known you for 20 years, she said in a low voice. "I've never seen you give this much credence to folklore. I've never seen buildings under a mountain lake before," he countered. "Something's there, Sarah. Whether it's an archaeological find or something else, we need to know." "And if it is something else?" she pressed. Daniel glanced ahead at Elias, who was now deep in conversation with Marcus. "Then I'm glad I've got the right people with me to figure it out." As they crested the ridge, the vast cirque of widows pole opened before them, a perfect glacial valley cradling a frozen lake that gleamed like polished glass in the afternoon light. The descent into Widow's Bowl took nearly an hour. The path zigzagged down the steep cirque wall, requiring careful footing on snow-covered switchbacks. By the time they reached the valley floor, the winter sun hung low, casting long blue shadows across the pristine basin. "We should make camp here," Daniel suggested, indicating a stand of fir trees that would provide some shelter from the wind. "It's too late to properly examine the lake today." No one argued. The trek had been demanding, and even Elias, despite his evident urgency, looked relieved at the prospect of rest. As Marcus and Sarah set up the tents, Emily walked to the lake's edge, her scientific curiosity drawing her forward. The ice was unlike anything she'd seen in her years of glacial research, clear as crystal in some places, with strange, swirling patterns beneath the surface in others. She knelt, brushing away a thin dusting of snow to reveal an almost transparent window into the depths. Something glinted below, metallic perhaps or crystalline, but the angle of the sun made it difficult to discern details. "Remarkable clarity," she murmured, reaching for her equipment. "I wouldn't touch the ice directly," Elias warned, approaching with his staff tapping rhythmically against the frozen ground. "Not with bare skin," Emily glanced up. "Why? It's just ice." "Is it?" The old shepherd's weathered face was solemn in the fading light. From his pocket he withdrew a brass object, an antique compass with ornate engraving around its edges. "Here, take this." Emily accepted it with a scientist's careful hands. "It's beautiful. 19th century? 1878. My great-grandfather's." Elias nodded toward the lake. "Walk around the perimeter. Watch what happens." Intrigued, Emily began circling the shoreline, eyes fixed on the compass. For several minutes, nothing unusual occurred. The needle pointed steadily north, as expected. Then as she reached the western edge, it swung sharply, pointing directly toward the center of the lake. She stopped, tapped the compass case, and rotated in place. The needle remained fixed on the lake, ignoring Earth's magnetic field entirely. "Fascinating," she whispered, scientific mind racing through possibilities. "Could be a local magnetic anomaly, perhaps iron deposits or—" A flock of ravens burst, suddenly from the tree line, their harsh calls echoing across the valley. The birds circled frantically before flying over the ridge, abandoning their roosts as night approached, behavior contrary to their nature. Daniel joined his daughter, watching the birds disappear. "That's not normal." "Neither is this compass," Emily replied, showing him the anomalous reading. Back at the campsite, Marcus had built a small fire, its warm glow creating a pocket of comfort against the gathering darkness. As the team huddled around the flames, sharing a meal of trail rations, an unnatural silence enveloped the valley, no wind in the trees, no nocturnal creatures stirring. "I've spent my life in these mountains," Marcus said, breaking the silence. "Never heard them this quiet." Sarah rubbed her hands near the fire. "Perhaps we've disturbed the local wildlife, or perhaps they know better than to stay," Elias replied. He had eaten little, his attention focused on the lake, now a dark mirror reflecting the emerging stars. "You mentioned your family has watched this place for generations," Daniel said. "What exactly were they watching for?" Elias's eyes reflected the firelight. Signs of awakening, changes in the ice, animals behaving strangely. He gestured toward the unnaturally still lake. "In my grandfather's journal, he described a winter in 1934 when the lake ice turned clear. 3 shepherds disappeared that season." "What happened to them?" Emily asked. "The official report said they fell through the ice. Their bodies were never recovered." Elias's voice lowered. "But my grandfather wrote that one returned briefly, changed, speaking in tongues, skin cold as death, before walking back into the lake." Sarah exchanged skeptical glances with Emily. "These stories often grow with retelling. Yet here you are," Elias noted, "drawn by the same mystery that has claimed others." The fire crackled, sending sparks toward the star-filled sky. Daniel studied the old shepherd's face, seeking deception, but finding only genuine concern. "Tomorrow," Daniel said, "we'll examine the lake properly, document everything. If there are ruins down there, we need to understand what they are and how they came to be under a mountain lake." "And if Elias is right," Marcus asked quietly, "if there's something dangerous, then we'll handle that too," Daniel assured him, though the confident words felt hollow against the valley's unnatural silence. As the others retired to their tents, Daniel took first watch, his ranger training making him uncomfortable with leaving. The camp unguarded, Elias joined him, seemingly requiring little rest despite his age and their difficult journey. "You should sleep," Daniel advised. Elias shook his head. "I haven't truly slept since I first saw what's beneath the ice." He pulled his coat tighter. "Your daughter, she's gifted, but skeptical. Emily believes in what she can measure and test," Daniel replied. "Her mother was the one who embraced mystery. And you? Daniel gazed across the dark valley. 30 years in the wilderness teaches you that some things defy easy explanation. Elias nodded, satisfied with the answer. From inside his coat he withdrew a silver flask and offered it to Daniel. "My father's recipe," he explained, "for cold nights and colder discoveries." Daniel accepted, taking a small sip of surprisingly smooth whiskey before passing it back. As warmth spread through his chest, a distant sound caught his attention, something between a crack and a moan, emanating from the lake. Both men turned toward the sound. For a brief moment, Daniel thought he saw movement beneath the ice, a shifting shadow that had nothing to do with the moonlight or stars. "It knows we're here," Elias whispered, gripping his carved staff tightly. "It's been waiting." Dawn broke over Widow's Bowl in watercolor shades of pink and gold. The team emerged from their tents to find the valley transformed. Overnight, the light dusting of snow had vanished from the lake's surface, leaving the ice eerily transparent, as if some unseen hand had polished it to glass. "This isn't natural," Emily murmured, crouching at the shoreline. She pressed a gloved hand against the ice, feeling its unusual warmth. Despite temperatures well below freezing, the surface wasn't as cold as it should have been. Daniel surveyed the scene with growing unease. 20 yards from shore, the frozen shapes of sheep were clearly visible. Elias's missing flock, caught in eternal poses of panic, their woolly bodies suspended in the ice. "We need to document everything before we attempt any examination of the structures," Sarah said, her archaeological training asserting itself. She began unpacking cameras and measuring tools from her backpack. Elias stood apart from the others, leaning heavily on his staff, his roomy eyes fixed on the center of the lake where the ice seemed clearest. "It's never been this transparent," he repeated softly. "Not in any of the family records." Marcus approached the old shepherd, offering him a steaming cup of coffee. "Mr. Thorne, in your family's stories, was there ever an explanation for what the village was? Who built it?" Elias accepted the cup with trembling hands. "My grandfather called them the Forgotten, a people who possessed knowledge that was never meant for mankind." He sipped the coffee. The lake was their prison, not their home. While they spoke, Emily had ventured further onto the ice, testing its thickness with specialized equipment. "The structural integrity is sound," she called back, "at least 9 inches thick throughout. It can support our weight easily." Daniel joined her, bootsteps cautious on the glassy surface. As they advanced toward the center, the underwater vista expanded beneath them, stone buildings emerging from the murky depths, their architecture unlike anything Daniel had seen in his decades exploring the region's historical sites. The structures followed no recognizable pattern, neither the practical designs of pioneer settlements nor the traditional layouts of indigenous villages. Streets curved in spiral formations around a central building that resembled a temple or meeting hall. Arched doorways and windows, punctuated walls inlaid with symbols similar to those on Elias's staff and pendant. "This isn't possible," Sarah whispered, having joined them on the ice. She knelt, wiping condensation from the surface with her sleeve, pressing her face close for a better view. "These structures show no signs of water erosion, yet they must have been submerged for centuries." Emily circled a particular area where the ice formed a perfect lens, magnifying the details below. "The preservation is remarkable. Look at the precision of those carvings." She pointed to symbols etched into a stone archway. "And those artifacts, they appear to be made of metal yet show no corrosion." Daniel felt a cold certainty settling in his chest that had nothing to do with the winter air. What they were seeing defied rational explanation. A perfectly preserved village that shouldn't exist, under a lake that shouldn't be so clear. "There," Marcus said suddenly, pointing toward a dark shape near the settlement's edge. One of the sheep broke through. Indeed, a gap in the otherwise perfect ice showed where one animal had apparently fallen into the water. Unlike its frozen companions, this sheep was nowhere to be seen. The ice must have weakened in that spot, Emily reasoned, though her scientific certainty seemed to waver. Elias had finally ventured onto the lake, his staff tapping rhythmically against the surface. When he reached the group, he removed something from his pocket, a perfectly formed disc of ice, clear as diamond and roughly the size of a pocket watch. "The seeing glass," he explained, handing it to Daniel, "passed down through generations. Look through it at what lies beneath." Daniel held the ice disc over a section of the lake. The effect was immediate and startling. Details that had been murky became crystal clear, colors more vibrant, textures almost tangible. Through the lens he could see inside the buildings, where furniture and household items remained as if their owners had simply stepped away momentarily. "It's a focusing crystal," Emily said, reaching for it with scientific curiosity. "The molecular structure must be—" "It's older than science," Elias interrupted. "Formed from the first ice that covered the village." Sarah, who had been systematically photographing the underwater scene, looked up with concern. "I think I saw movement down there." The group fell silent, all eyes fixing on the spot she indicated, a narrow street between two buildings. For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Then a shadow drifted across the thoroughfare, not cast by any visible object, but moving with purpose, like a creature swimming through the frozen depths. "There shouldn't be anything alive down there," Emily whispered, "not in these conditions." "Unless," Marcus suggested quietly, "it doesn't need to breathe." Daniel's hand moved instinctively to the sidearm he carried as Chief Ranger. "We need a better look, and we need answers." He turned to Sarah. "How quickly can you set up a proper research operation? With what we have here, limited, but enough to document and perhaps retrieve small artifacts if we can create an access point." "No," Elias protested, suddenly agitated. "We shouldn't disturb anything, just observe and leave." But Daniel could see the scientific determination hardening in both Sarah's and Emily's expressions. The discovery was too significant to abandon. "We'll establish a proper camp," he decided. "Safe protocols for ice work. No one goes anywhere alone, and we maintain communication at all times." As the team moved back toward shore to retrieve their equipment, Daniel lingered, still holding the ice crystal. Through it he studied the central temple-like structure again. This time he was certain. A light flickered within, like a distant lantern carried by unseen hands. By mid-afternoon, the research camp had taken shape. Two large, dome-shaped tents served as a base of operations, one for equipment and analysis, the other for shelter and warmth. Sarah had transformed the first into a makeshift archaeology lab, with portable tables holding cameras, sample containers, and documentation materials. Emily and Marcus worked methodically at the lake's edge, using a specialized ice drill to create a safe access point. The whine of the motor echoed unnaturally across the valley, seeming to bounce back with a distorted quality that set Daniel's teeth on edge. "Almost through," Emily announced, her breath fogging in the cold air. "Core samples show consistent density until about 30 feet down, then the composition changes dramatically." "Changes how?" Daniel asked, watching his daughter work with grudging admiration for her expertise. "The lower ice contains unusual particulates, microscopic crystalline structures I've never seen before." She gestured to a series of sample tubes. "And its melting point is wrong. It should behave like normal ice, but it's resistant." Marcus shut off the drill as it broke through the final layer. Water welled up through the 18-inch hole, dark and viscous, with an iridescent quality that caught the afternoon light in prismatic patterns. "That's not normal lake water," he observed quietly. Emily collected a sample in a sterile container. "No, it's not. The viscosity is more like oil, but it's definitely aqueous." She held the container up to the light. "And there's something suspended in it, particles of some kind." Inside the research tent, Sarah was carefully cataloguing photographic evidence when Daniel entered with the water sample. "We're through the ice," he informed her. "Emily's running preliminary tests on the water. Sarah looked up from her computer screen. Daniel, I've been comparing the structures to every known archaeological record in the region. There's nothing remotely similar, not from indigenous cultures, not from European settlers, not from anyone. She turned the screen to show him enhanced images of the underwater buildings. The architecture suggests a level of sophistication that shouldn't have existed in this region during any known historical period. And the symbols, she pointed to a recurring pattern etched into many of the structures. They don't match any known writing system or decorative tradition. Could it be from elsewhere, a culture from another region that somehow established itself here? Sarah shook her head. The materials appear local, native stone and metals, but the designs, she hesitated. The closest parallel I can find is in certain prehistoric cave paintings that depict what some fringe archaeologists call non-human intelligence. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You're not suggesting... I'm not suggesting anything yet, she interrupted. Just reporting what I'm seeing. Outside, a shout from Marcus drew their attention. Daniel rushed from the tent to find the ranger standing at the drill site, pointing at something in the water. The access hole, which had been 18 inches wide, had somehow expanded to nearly 3 feet in diameter. The edges were smooth, as if the ice had melted perfectly uniformly, and the dark water now lapped gently against the opening's rim. It just dissolved, Marcus explained, bewilderment evident in his voice. I was securing the safety equipment, turned my back for maybe 2 minutes, and when I looked again... Emily knelt by the expanded opening, scientific curiosity overriding caution. The water temperature is barely above freezing, yet it melted the ice this quickly. She looked up at her father. This defies everything I know about thermal dynamics. Elias had been watching silently from several yards away, his expression grim. Now he approached, his staff tapping a rhythm that seemed to counterpoint the gentle lapping of the dark water. It's inviting us in, he said softly. Before anyone could respond, something broke the water's surface. A stone object rising, as if lifted by unseen hands. It hovered momentarily at the edge of the hole before settling onto the ice with a dull thud. The team stared in stunned silence at the artifact. A rectangular tablet approximately 12 inches long and 8 inches wide, carved from a dark green stone resembling jade. Its surface was covered in the same enigmatic symbols they had observed on the underwater structures. Sarah was the first to move, her archaeological training temporarily overriding her shock. She approached carefully, not touching the tablet, but examining it closely. It's some kind of inscription, she murmured, similar to the markings on the buildings, but more formal, like a written record rather than decorative elements. How did it get up here? Marcus asked, voicing the question everyone was thinking. Water pressure changes, Emily suggested, though her tone lacked conviction. Perhaps gases released from the lake bottom. Elias shook his head. It was sent, a message. Daniel knelt beside Sarah. Can you decipher any of it? Not immediately, but there are recurring patterns that might function as linguistic elements. She pointed to a sequence of symbols. This grouping appears multiple times, which suggests it might be an important word or concept. While they discussed the tablet, Emily had been monitoring her equipment, which was taking continuous readings of the water. Suddenly she frowned. The water composition is changing, she announced. Oxygen content increasing, particulate concentration decreasing. It's becoming more normal. As if in response to her observation, the surface of the dark water began to ripple. The team backed away instinctively, but Daniel moved closer, drawn by a ranger's responsibility to investigate. The ripples increased, forming concentric circles emanating from the center of the opening. Then, without warning, the water stilled completely, becoming a perfect mirror that reflected the winter sky above. I need to see what's down there, Daniel decided, turning to Emily. Did you bring diving equipment? She nodded reluctantly. Emergency gear only. A single tank, regulator, mask, basic stuff. That'll do. Daniel, you can't be serious, Sarah protested. We have no idea what's in that water, which is exactly why someone needs to look. He met each of their gazes in turn. We came here for answers. The only way to get them is to go down there. Elias gripped his arm with surprising strength. If you go, take this. He pressed something into Daniel's palm, a small, smooth stone that seemed to pulse with inner warmth. My grandfather called it a warding stone. It's been passed down with instructions to carry it if anyone ever entered the water. Daniel studied the unassuming object. Despite his pragmatic nature, something told him to accept the old man's offering. He pocketed the stone with a nod of thanks. As Emily helped him prepare the diving equipment, the water in the opening began to shimmer with an internal light, faint but unmistakable, like moonlight filtering through thin clouds. Be careful, Emily said quietly as she helped him secure the mask. The professional detachment in her voice had given way to genuine concern. Whatever's down there, it's not following the rules of nature as we understand them. Daniel squeezed her shoulder, the first affectionate gesture between them in years. I'll be back before you know it. With those words, he slipped into the dark water, descending into the unknown depths of Widow's Bowl. The cold embraced Daniel like an old friend, familiar, demanding respect, but not immediately threatening. As he descended through the dark water, the beam of his underwater light caught, suspended, particles that drifted like tiny stars in a liquid universe. The regulator's rhythmic hiss provided the only sound beyond the soft thudding of his heartbeat in his ears. 20 feet down, the water clarity improved dramatically. The viscous quality Emily had noted seemed confined to the upper layer, giving way to an unnaturally clear medium that allowed visibility far beyond what should have been possible in a mountain lake. Daniel oriented himself toward the nearest structure, a building with an arched entrance that might once have been a dwelling. As he approached, the beam of his light revealed details invisible from above. Intricate carvings around doorframes, window-like openings with latticed stone, and the remnants of what appeared to be furniture, preserved as if the waters had only recently claimed them rather than centuries ago. Inside his pocket, Elias's warding stone pulsed with gentle warmth against his thigh, a small comfort in the overwhelming strangeness surrounding him. A flash of movement caught his eye, something darting between buildings in the underwater settlement. Daniel adjusted his trajectory, swimming cautiously toward the spot. His light beams swept across an open area resembling a town square, illuminating something that stopped him cold. Footprints in the silt of the lake bottom, fresh enough that small clouds of disturbed sediment still hovered above them. The rational part of his mind catalogued explanations: underwater currents, fish activity, the natural settling of submerged objects. But 30 years of wilderness experience told him something else entirely. He was not alone down here. Daniel checked his oxygen gauge. 14 minutes of air remaining. Enough time to investigate one building thoroughly before returning to the surface. He chose the structure at the center of the settlement, the temple-like building they had observed from above. As he swam toward it, a sound penetrated the water's muffling embrace, a low, rhythmic tone like the resonance of a bronze bell. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the water and into his bones. The temple entrance loomed before him, a massive stone archway covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change as his light passed over them. Inside, the single large chamber housed a raised stone platform that might have served as an altar. Upon it sat a bronze object approximately 2 feet high, unmistakably a bell, though its design was like nothing Daniel had seen before. As he approached, the bell's surface began to glow with a soft, amber light, and the resonant tone intensified. Without being struck, the bell was somehow ringing, a gentle, continuous sound that seemed to bypass his ears and speak directly to his mind. Something compelled Daniel to reach out, to touch the artifact that had no business being so perfectly preserved in these depths. As his fingertips neared the bronze surface, images flashed through his consciousness. People in strange clothing gathering in the square, the same bell being carried in procession, water rising not as a natural flood, but as if called. Faces turned skyward as the lake claimed them, not in fear, but in purpose. Daniel jerked his hand back, disoriented by the vivid impressions. His oxygen gauge beeped a 5-minute warning. Reluctantly, he turned from the bell, which continued its silent ringing. As he swam toward the surface, the unsettling certainty followed him. The village hadn't been flooded by accident or natural disaster. Its inhabitants had deliberately called the waters to cover them. You're saying they drowned themselves intentionally? Sarah's voice carried equal measures of academic skepticism and horrified fascination. An entire settlement. Back on the surface, wrapped in thermal blankets inside the research tent, Daniel recounted his discoveries while Emily analyzed water samples collected during the dive. Not just drowned, Daniel clarified, still struggling to articulate what he'd experienced. It was more like a deliberate containment, as if they were trapping something beneath them, using the water as a seal. Marcus, who had been quietly examining the stone tablet, looked up. That aligns with some of our oldest stories. A time when the people of the valleys called the waters to fight an ancient darkness. Metaphorical language, Sarah suggested. Though her usual academic certainty seemed strained, cultural memories of natural disasters often take on symbolic characteristics. These don't look like metaphors to me, Emily interrupted, turning her laptop screen to show magnified images of the water samples. These particles in the water, they're not geological or biological. Their structure is, she hesitated, engineered. In the corner of the tent, Elias sat hunched over a small camp stove, brewing a pungent tea from supplies in his ancient backpack. The waters of Widow's Bowl have always been different, he commented. My grandfather wrote that they have power over dreams. As if on cue, Sarah suppressed a yawn. Speaking of which, I can barely keep my eyes open. None of us slept well last night. We should rest in shifts, Daniel decided. 2 awake at all times, monitoring the site and equipment. As the team prepared for their rotation, Emily approached her father privately. That bell you described, I think I've seen it before. Daniel looked at her sharply. Where? In my dreams last night. I was standing in a stone room, watching people place it on an altar. Her scientific certainty wavered. Dad, I dreamed about a place I'd never seen before you discovered it. Before Daniel could respond, Marcus called them outside. The winter sun had set, casting the valley in deep blue twilight. Above the lake, a strange mist had formed. Not the typical fog of temperature differentials, but a swirling vapor that moved with apparent purpose, circling the area where they had broken through the ice. It started a few minutes ago, Marcus explained, right after the ice sealed itself. Sealed? Daniel strode to the access point. Where the 3-foot opening had been, smooth ice had reformed, solid and clear as the surrounding surface, with no indication it had ever been breached. Emily knelt, testing the new ice with her equipment. This is impossible. Ice formation doesn't work this way, especially not this quickly. Elias joined them, leaning heavily on his staff. It doesn't want us down there again. Not yet. As darkness claimed the valley, the team retreated to the tents, unease settling over the camp, like the strange mist that continued to dance across the frozen lake. They established their watch rotation, Sarah and Marcus taking the first shift, Daniel and Emily the second, with Elias insisting he needed little sleep. In the quiet of the research tent, Sarah continued working on the stone tablet, methodically photographing and cataloguing its symbols. Her academic training kept her focused, despite the growing strangeness surrounding them. I think I've identified a pattern, she told Marcus, pointing to recurring symbol groups. This sequence appears at the beginning of several lines. It could be a form of address or invocation. Can you read any of it? Not read exactly, but recognize elements. She indicated a particular symbol. This one shares characteristics with very early proto-writing systems from Mesopotamia. And this one, she pointed to another, has structural similarities to certain Chinese oracle bone inscriptions, but the combination is unlike anything in the archaeological record. As Sarah worked, a soft sound reached them, a whisper, quiet, tone that seemed to emanate from the tablet itself, the same resonant quality that Daniel had described from the underwater bell, but gentler, almost like a lullaby. Marcus rubbed his eyes, suddenly fighting a wave of exhaustion. "Do you hear that?" Sarah nodded, her own eyelids growing heavy. "It's just the wind." Within minutes, despite their resolve to remain vigilant, both slumped over the research table, deep in dreams filled with images of the underwater village. Not as ruins, but as a living, vibrant settlement. Outside, the mist continued its patient circling, waiting for the dreams to do their work. Daniel woke to find the research tent empty, Sarah and Marcus's sleeping bags neatly arranged but unoccupied. The illuminated face of his watch showed 3:17 a.m. Their watch should have continued for another hour before waking him and Emily. A quick check of the adjacent tent revealed Emily also asleep, though she stirred as he gently shook her shoulder. "Something's wrong," he said quietly as she blinked awake. Sarah and Marcus left their post. Emily sat up, instantly alert. The equipment still there. Nothing disturbed. Daniel handed her a jacket. But they're gone. Outside, the night hung heavy with unusual stillness. No wind, no animal sounds, not even the subtle creak of ice that typically accompanied winter nights in the wilderness. Fresh snow had fallen, covering their earlier tracks with a pristine white blanket that glowed faintly in the starlight. There, Emily pointed to a single set of footprints leading from the tent toward the lake. Two people, walking side by side, their gait measured and unhurried. Daniel retrieved his sidearm and a powerful flashlight from his pack. "Stay close." They followed the tracks to the lake's edge, where they continued directly onto the ice. In the beam of Daniel's light, they could see Sarah and Marcus standing motionless at the center of the frozen surface, gazing down at something below. "Sarah!" Daniel called, his voice unnaturally loud in the silent night. "Marcus!" Neither responded, their attention fixed on whatever lay beneath their feet. Daniel started across the ice, Emily close behind. As they approached, he could see that Sarah held the stone tablet against her chest, while Marcus clutched something else, a wooden object with a carved face. "It's some kind of mask," Emily whispered. Indeed, Marcus held what appeared to be a ceremonial mask, its features neither human nor animal, but something unsettlingly between. Even from several yards away, Daniel could see that the wooden face seemed to shift subtly, its expression changing without actually moving. "Sarah," Daniel said firmly, reaching for her arm, "what are you doing out here?" She turned slowly, her eyes distant and unfocused. "They're showing us," she murmured. "Their history, their purpose." "Who is?" Emily asked. "The Watchers," Marcus answered, his voice equally detached. "The ones who sacrifice themselves to contain what sleeps below." Daniel gently pried the tablet from Sarah's grasp, while Emily carefully took the mask from Marcus. As the artifacts left their hands, both researchers seemed to wake from a trance, blinking in confusion. "Daniel?" Sarah rubbed her eyes. "What are we doing out here?" "You tell me," he replied, guiding them both back toward shore. "You were sleepwalking or something like it." Back at the camp, they found Elias stoking a small fire, unsurprised by the night's events. "The dreams have started," he said simply. "Earlier than I expected." Marcus warmed his hands by the flames, eyeing the mask that Emily had placed on a research table. "I remember a ceremony," he said slowly. "People wearing masks like that one, dancing around the central temple." Sarah nodded. I saw them writing on stone tablets, recording something important, something they feared would be forgotten. These aren't just dreams, Emily noted, her scientific mind struggling to categorize the experience. They're too consistent, too specific. It's almost like memories, Elias finished for her. Not yours. Theirs. Daniel placed the stone tablet beside the mask. What exactly do you think is happening here, Elias? The old shepherd sipped from a steaming mug of his herbal tea. The village is reaching out, trying to communicate through the only means available to it, dreams and impressions. Villages don't communicate, Emily objected. Structures don't have consciousness. Perhaps not the structures themselves. Elias allowed. But those who built them? Those who still remain in some form? The implication hung in the air, too extraordinary for immediate acceptance, yet increasingly difficult to dismiss. The tablet, Sarah said suddenly, turning to her notes. I've been translating fragments based on comparative linguistics and repeated patterns. She flipped through her notebook to a specific page. This symbol group appears repeatedly in what seems to be a warning context. She pointed to a sequence of intricate markings that resembled interlocked circles with radial lines. The closest translation I can determine is the devourer or the consumer of light, and it's always accompanied by these symbols, which suggest containment or imprisonment. Marcus examined her notes. That corresponds with elements of our tribe's forbidden stories, a being of darkness captured beneath sacred waters. You're suggesting these people deliberately flooded their own settlement to trap some kind of entity beneath it? Emily's skepticism remained, though less certain than before. Not flooded, Daniel corrected, remembering his underwater vision. Sacrificed. They called the waters willingly, knowing they would die. The first light of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, casting the frozen lake in pale gold illumination. With daylight approaching, Daniel made a decision. We need to see more of what's down there. The ice has resealed itself, but there must be another way to access the ruins. There is, Elias said quietly, but it's dangerous. The old stories speak of a ceremonial entry point, a doorway used by the village priests to communicate with what they imprisoned. Where? The central temple, the place where you found the bell. Elias fixed Daniel with a grave look, but opening that door might allow influence to flow both ways. Despite the warning, Sarah's archaeological enthusiasm couldn't be contained. If there's a preserved entrance mechanism, it could tell us volumes about their technological capabilities and their purpose, Marcus added. Why they believed such an extreme measure was necessary. Emily had been examining the mask more closely, her scientific detachment giving way to fascinated curiosity. The craftsmanship is extraordinary, but that's not what makes it unusual. She held it up to the growing light. The wood itself is wrong. Cell structure unlike anything I've seen, and it's not petrified despite centuries underwater. As she turned the mask in her hands, the carved face seemed to watch them, with eyes that shifted imperceptibly, following their movements without actually moving. Put it down, Elias advised sharply. The ceremonial artifacts are conduits. Conduits for what? Emily asked, though she carefully returned the mask to the table. Influence. Awareness. The old shepherd's rheumy eyes fixed on the frozen lake. The boundary between what's beneath and what's above grows thinner. Can't you feel it? Indeed, something had changed in the atmosphere around them. The air itself seemed heavier, charged with anticipation, like the stillness before a thunderstorm. Daniel studied the lake in the strengthening daylight. The ice remained crystal clear, the underwater ruins perfectly visible, except for a new detail that sent a chill down his spine. The footprints he had observed in the silt of the lake bottom now led up to the very spot where they stood, as if whatever had made them had followed them to the surface. We need to find that doorway, he decided. Today, by mid-morning. Equipment. Malfunctions began. First, Sarah's laptop crashed while analyzing symbol patterns from the tablet. Then Emily's atmospheric monitoring devices gave impossible readings, reporting temperatures of 70 degrees Fahrenheit despite the obvious winter conditions. The satellite phone showed full signal but couldn't connect to any network. Interference? Emily suggested dismantling a sensor to check for physical damage, maybe mineral deposits in the surrounding rock affecting electronics. Daniel wasn't convinced. The timing felt deliberate, as if something were isolating them from the outside world. While examining the perimeter of their camp, he discovered a smooth, round stone half buried in snow. About the size of his palm, it appeared unremarkable, except for its perfect spherical shape and the subtle color variations that shifted across its surface, darkening like storm clouds gathering when held up to the light. "A weather stone," Elias explained when Daniel showed it to him. "Another artifact from the village. They appear when change approaches." "They appear?" Daniel repeated skeptically. "You mean they resurface from the ice?" "I mean they appear," Elias insisted. "My grandfather documented 3 such appearances during his lifetime. Each preceded a disturbance." Daniel placed the stone on their research table beside the mask. "What kind of disturbance?" "The last one was in 1954. 3 university researchers came to study the lake's unusual ice formation patterns. They found similar ruins beneath, tried to excavate." Elias's voice dropped. "The ice fractured without warning. 2 drowned. The 3rd made it back to our ranch, babbling about shadows that moved through water. He died of hypothermia, despite sitting beside our kitchen stove." Emily had joined them, scientific curiosity outweighing her skepticism. She examined the weather. "Stone with a handheld spectroscope. It's absorbing and reflecting light at variable rates," she reported, "almost like a responsive material." She looked up. "If I didn't know better, I'd say it was technological, not natural." Above the lake, strange lights had begun to dance. Not the aurora borealis, which occasionally graced these latitudes, but concentrated points of bluish illumination that moved with apparent purpose, tracing patterns that mimicked the symbols on the stone tablet. "We're seeing more activity in a single day than all the events recorded in my family's journals combined," Elias noted with growing concern. "Something's accelerating the cycle." "What cycle?" Sarah asked, joining them from the research tent. "The awakening." Elias gestured toward the lake. "Every 75 years, approximately, the boundary thins. The water remembers its purpose. The ice clears." Marcus, who had been documenting the lights with a camera, looked troubled. "That matches our tribal calendar. Every 3rd generation, the elders perform a special ceremony at Mirror Lake. Not this one, but another sacred site that shares characteristics with it." "A reinforcement ritual," Elias nodded. "Different guardians, same purpose." "This is all fascinating cultural perspective," Emily interjected, "but we need scientific explanations. These phenomena must have rational causes." "Does that look rational to you?" Daniel pointed to the center of the lake, where the ice had begun to emit a soft, pulsing glow, synchronized precisely with the dancing lights above. Sarah's archaeological pragmatism finally wavered. "In 30 years of fieldwork, I've never seen anything like this." She turned to Elias. "If your family's records are accurate, what happens next in the cycle?" "Manifestations. Physical effects beyond mere lights and dreams." The old shepherd clutched his staff tightly. "Then if the boundary fails completely, emergence." "Emergence of what?" Emily asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't certain she wanted the answer. Before Elias could respond, a deep, resonant tone emanated from the lake. The same bell-like sound Daniel had heard during his dive, but louder, powerful enough to vibrate the ice beneath their feet. With the sound came a pressure change that made their ears pop, followed by a wave of cold that penetrated even their insulated winter gear. Frost formed instantly on eyebrows and eyelashes. "Inside, now!" Daniel ordered, recognizing an imminent threat when he felt one. They hurried into the research tent, zipping the heavy weatherproof entrance behind them. Through the transparent vinyl windows, they watched as the strange lights intensified, their patterns becoming more complex and deliberate. "It's a language," Sarah whispered, comparing the aerial displays to her tablet notes. "They're communicating." "With what?" Marcus asked. "With who?" Elias corrected quietly. "The temperature inside." The tent plummeted, despite the portable heater running at maximum capacity. Their breath crystallized in the air as frost patterns formed on the interior surfaces. Not random ice crystals, but the same symbolic patterns found on the stone tablet and temple carvings. "We need to leave," Emily stated firmly. Scientists, confidence finally giving way to human instinct. "Whatever's happening here is beyond our capacity to study safely." Daniel moved to the tent entrance, intending to assess their quickest route back to the vehicles. As he unzipped the door, a blast of Arctic air rushed in, carrying with it swirling snow that coalesced briefly into a humanoid shape before dissipating. He slammed the zipper closed, heart pounding. "Did everyone see that?" The grim faces surrounding him confirmed they had. "The real question," Marcus said, "is whether we can leave at all." A quick exploration confirmed his concern. Beyond the immediate perimeter of their camp, visibility had dropped to near zero in a localized snowstorm that circled them like a predator. The well-marked trail they had followed to reach the lake was now impossible to discern. "We're being contained," Elias stated matter-of-factly, just as it was contained, a reflection of its own imprisonment. Sarah had returned to her notes with renewed urgency. There must be something in the inscriptions, a clue about how the original inhabitants managed these phenomena, or how they failed to, Daniel said grimly. Emily, ever practical, began cataloguing their supplies. "We have provisions for 3 days. After that, she didn't need to finish the thought. Winter survival in the backcountry required either adequate supplies or the ability to reach safety. They were rapidly losing both options. As darkness approached again, the team gathered in the research tent, the haunting glow from the lake providing more illumination than their electric lanterns. The artifacts they had collected, the tablet, mask, and weatherstone, now sat at the center of their meeting, each emanating a subtle energy that even the most skeptical among them could sense. "We need to understand what happened here," Daniel decided. "Not just for our own safety, but because whatever these people contained might not stay contained much longer." No one disagreed. The boundary between observer and participant had dissolved. They were now part of the lake's story, whether they wished to be or not. As night deepened, the team huddled in the research tent, the portable heater struggling against the unnatural cold. Outside, the lights continued their aerial dance, reflecting off the glowing ice in mesmerizing patterns that were increasingly difficult to look away from. Elias sat near the center, his weathered hands cradling a leather-bound book he had retrieved. From his pack, a family Bible, its pages worn thin with age and handling. Tucked between those pages were dozens of handwritten notes, some on parchment so old it threatened to crumble at the slightest touch. "It's time you understood," he said, his voice carrying the weight of generations. "Why my family has watched this place, why we never sought help or reported what we knew." The others gathered closer, even Emily setting aside her scientific instruments, to listen. "The Thorne family came to this valley in 1862, Elias began, carefully opening the Bible to reveal marginalia dating back over a century. "My great-great-grandfather Ezekiel was 16 when they settled, a shepherd boy with a gift for finding lost things." He turned weathered pages delicately, pointing to faded handwriting. "These are his original notes. He was the first to find the lake, though indigenous people had known of it for centuries. He saw the ruins beneath the ice, clearer then than they had ever been before or since. Until now." Daniel leaned forward. "What did he do?" "He brought Others, at first, his father, the local preacher, two miners from nearby camps. They planned to drain the lake, recover whatever valuables might be preserved below. Elias's expression darkened. The first attempt ended with a sudden snowstorm that killed the miners. The second with his father falling through seemingly solid ice. By the third attempt, only Ezekiel and the preacher remained. He turned to another page, where the handwriting changed, more educated, precise. The preacher began documenting strange occurrences, dreams of the underwater village, lights above the ice, unexplained sounds. Then he met an old Blackfoot medicine man who shared the tribal knowledge of the place. What little could be spoken aloud. Marcus nodded solemnly. Some stories are restricted even within the tribe, knowledge considered too dangerous for most. The medicine man told them the lake contained something ancient, something that had nearly destroyed his people centuries before. An entity that fed on human consciousness, growing stronger with each mind it touched. Elias paused, gauging their reactions. He called it the Thought Eater in the white man's tongue, though the Blackfoot name translates more closely to the one who consumes what makes us human. Sarah compared this to her notes. That aligns with my partial translations of consumer of light, if light is interpreted metaphorically as consciousness or soul. The village, Elias continued, was built by an earlier people who discovered how to temporarily contain the entity through a combination of physical and spiritual barriers. But their containment was failing. The entity had grown too strong, influencing too many minds. So they made the ultimate sacrifice. They flooded their own settlement, Emily said, the scientific impossibility of the tale, now secondary to its internal logic. Not just flooded, they became the new containment. Their combined consciousness, willingly given, created a barrier the entity couldn't break. Elias turned more pages, revealing detailed drawings of the underwater structures, remarkably similar to what they had observed. The water and ice were merely physical components. The true prison was made of sacrificed minds. That's why the dreams are so vivid, Marcus realized. We're not imagining their village. We're experiencing their memories, preserved somehow in this place. Elias nodded. For generations, my family has served as watchers, monitoring the cycles of containment, performing small rituals when necessary to reinforce the barrier. Never more than one or two of us at a time to limit the entity's potential influence. But something's changed, Daniel observed. This cycle is different, more intense. Yes. Elias coughed, a deep rattling sound that revealed more about his health than he had previously let on. I am the last thorn. The bloodline that has maintained the watch for 7 generations ends with me. He closed the Bible carefully. Each watcher has passed knowledge and responsibility to their children. I have no children, and I am dying, cancer, spreading through my lungs and bones. The doctors gave me 3 months. That was 5 months ago. The tent fell silent except for the wind's mournful howl and the occasional ping of ice forming on the exterior fabric. So you brought us here, Emily said, realization dawning. Not just to document the ruins, but to find new guardians. I had no choice, Elias admitted. The cycle was beginning, the ice was clearing. Without a watcher, without someone to perform the reinforcement rituals when the boundary thins, he left the consequences unspoken. Why not tell us this from the beginning? Daniel asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Would you have believed me? Elias smiled sadly. An old man with tales of thought-eating entities and sacrificial villages. You needed to see for yourselves, to feel its influence, to understand the truth through experience, not just words. Sarah studied the old shepherd with new eyes. These reinforcement rituals, what do they entail? Blood of the watcher, freely given. Words passed down through generations, placement of protective artifacts at key points within the underwater structures. Elias's hand trembled slightly as he touched his carved staff. Each watcher contributes a personal item that becomes imbued with protective energy through years of proximity to the lake. "Your staff," Marcus observed, "and my father's before me, his father's compass, my grandmother's pendant." Elias looked each of them in the eye. "I had hoped to find someone willing to take up the watch, someone who would understand the importance of what lies beneath these waters. But now I fear we face something far more urgent than succession." "The entity is waking," Daniel stated, not a question, but a grim acknowledgement. "Yes, and without a proper binding ritual, it will not merely influence minds, but consume them entirely." Elias's weathered face reflected the unnatural lights dancing outside. "Starting with those closest to it. Us." Dawn broke with a crack that echoed across the valley like a rifle shot. The team emerged from their tents to find a massive fissure stretching across the lake's surface, a jagged line that extended from shore to center, splitting the ice despite temperatures well. "Below, freezing? That's not possible," Emily whispered, her scientific mind still struggling to rationalize what they were witnessing. She knelt at the shore, carefully collecting a sample of the water now welling up through the crack. Unlike normal lake water, it retained the strange viscosity and iridescent quality they had observed earlier, but now, with a darker hue, almost black in the morning light, Daniel surveyed the situation with a ranger's practicality. How long before the entire surface destabilizes? With normal ice physics. Days? Maybe weeks. Emily studied the fracture pattern, but nothing about this is following normal physical laws. These edges aren't melting, they're dissolving. Indeed, the crack was widening not through typical ice melt, but through a process more akin to disintegration, the solid surface simply ceasing to exist along the fracture line. "We need to retrieve key artifacts now," Sarah urged, her archaeological instincts prioritizing preservation of knowledge. "Before we lose access completely," Daniel nodded grimly. "Quick retrieval only, nothing that puts anyone at risk." Despite his warning, they all understood the situation had already moved beyond safety considerations. Whatever was happening transcended normal wilderness hazards. They were witnessing something for which Daniel's 30 years of ranger experience offered no protocol. They worked methodically, using long-handled tools to recover small artifacts, visible just beneath the ice near the shore. Ceramic fragments, metal implements, small carved stones. Each item Sarah carefully documented before securing in specimen containers. Marcus, working several yards away, called out suddenly, "The temple! The doorway is becoming visible." They gathered at the spot he indicated. The ice near the central structure had thinned dramatically, revealing what appeared to be a stone staircase descending into the main temple building, a feature not visible during Daniel's earlier dive. "It wasn't there before," Daniel confirmed, studying the new configuration. "The entrance has changed, or revealed itself," Elias suggested, leaning heavily on his staff. His condition had deteriorated overnight, his breathing more labored, skin ashen beneath his weathered tan. Before anyone could respond, a tremendous groan emanated from the fractured ice. The main fissure widened abruptly, sending a network of smaller cracks radiating outward like a spider web. One of these secondary cracks raced toward where they stood, the ice dissolving in its wake. "Back to shore," Daniel ordered, but too late. The ice beneath Marcus collapsed, plunging him waist-deep into the dark water. He cried out, not from cold, but from something else entirely. "It's touching me," he gasped, face contorted in horror. "Something in the water. It's aware." Daniel and Emily lunged forward, grasping Marcus under the arms and hauling him from the water with desperate strength. As they dragged him onto solid ice, they could see dark tendrils of what looked like ink or oil clinging to his legs, reluctant to release their grip. Emily pulled a sample vial from her pocket and managed to capture a small amount of the strange substance before it dissolved into a vapor that dissipated in the morning air. Back at shore, they examined Marcus. Physically, he appeared unharmed. No frostbite or hypothermia despite his dunking in the frigid lake. But his eyes had changed. The pupils expanded so widely that the iris was barely visible, giving him an unsettling, almost inhuman appearance. "Marcus?" Daniel gripped the ranger's shoulder. "Can you hear me?" "I hear everything," Marcus whispered, his voice subtly altered. So many voices, so much knowledge. His gaze darted erratically, focusing on things no one else could see. "They're trying to warn us. They're trying to hold it back. But the barrier is failing." Sarah approached cautiously. "Who is trying to warn us, Marcus?" "The sacrificed, the willing, the ones who became the prison." He clutched Daniel's arm with surprising strength. "They cannot hold it much longer. Not alone." Emily had been examining the fluid sample, her expression growing increasingly troubled. "This isn't water." "Not entirely." She held up the vial to the light. "It has properties more consistent with organic material, like cerebrospinal fluid, but with unknown compounds." "The entity isn't just imprisoned in the lake," Elias said quietly. "It's becoming the lake." A sudden realization struck Daniel. "We need to leave now. Gather essential equipment only." As they hurriedly packed emergency supplies, the sky darkened despite the early hour, clouds gathering with unnatural speed. The wind shifted, now blowing in a circular pattern around the lake's perimeter, effectively creating a barrier of driving snow and ice. "It's containing us," Sarah observed, echoing Elias's earlier assessment. "Just as it was contained." When they attempted to follow their original trail back toward the vehicles, they found the path obscured by snowdrifts that seemed to form faster than they could clear them. After an hour of exhausting effort that gained them less than half a mile, they were forced to return to camp. "We're trapped," Emily concluded, the scientist in her finally accepting what the others already understood. "At least until we address what's happening in that lake." Marcus sat apart from the group, still disoriented from his encounter with the water. He had begun drawing symbols in the snow, precise replications of those found on the stone tablet, though he had never studied them closely. "The knowledge is within the water," he murmured when Sarah approached. "Memories preserved like insects in amber. A collective consciousness trapped between life and something else." Elias watched with knowing eyes. "He's touched the minds of the sacrificed. It will pass, but the experience will leave its mark." "Will he be okay?" Daniel asked. "Define okay," the old shepherd replied grimly. "He'll survive if that's what you're asking, but he'll never forget what he felt in those waters." Emily had been studying the lake through binoculars. "The crack has stopped expanding, but the ice is continuing to thin around the temple entrance. It's almost as if it's creating an access point," Daniel finished. "Inviting us in, or something out," Elias corrected. As they watched, the dark water within the main fissure began to glow with a pulsing bluish light, the same color as the aerial phenomena they had witnessed the previous night, but now emanating from beneath rather than above. "It's accelerating," Elias said, his voice tight with urgency. "Whatever's happening, we don't have much time left to stop it." "Stop what, exactly?" Emily demanded, frustration breaking through her scientific reserve. "We still don't fully understand what we're dealing with." Elias turned to her with solemn eyes. "The end of everything that makes us human. Thoughts, memories, consciousness itself. If what's beneath that ice escapes its prison entirely, it will consume minds the way fire consumes oxygen, without mercy or limit." The team gathered their remaining functional equipment and retreated to the research tent to formulate a plan. The weight of their impossible situation settling over them like the unnatural clouds that now obscured the valley. Inside the research tent, Sarah had made a breakthrough with the stone tablet. Using Marcus's unexpected knowledge as a guide, she had assembled a rudimentary translation system, mapping symbols to concepts rather than specific words. "It's not exactly a language," she explained, spreading her notes across the table. "More like a symbolic representation of complex ideas. Each character contains multiple layers of meaning." In the corner, Marcus sat with eyes half closed, still, processing the flood of alien memories from his immersion in the lake water. He would occasionally murmur corrections to Sarah's interpretations, speaking with certainty about matters he couldn't possibly know through conventional means. "This section," Sarah indicated the tablet's central portion, "appears to be a historical record of the entity's origin." She referred to her notes. "As best I can interpret, it describes something that fell from the stars when the world was young." "A meteorite?" Emily suggested, scientific rationality still seeking footholds. "Not exactly," Sarah continued reading. "It describes a consciousness, not a physical object, something that existed without form until it encountered the minds of early humans. It fed on their thoughts, dreams, and memories, growing stronger with each mind it touched." Daniel studied the symbols. How did these people learn to contain it? Sarah turned to another section of the tablet. "According to this, the entity has one vulnerability. It cannot create, only consume. The villagers discovered that freely, sacrificed consciousness, memories and thoughts willingly given, created a prison it couldn't break. The more minds contributed to the barrier, the stronger the containment." "So they sacrificed their entire village," Emily said softly. "Not just their lives, but their combined consciousness." "Yes, but with the understanding that the barrier would need periodic reinforcement." Sarah looked up gravely. "The containment was never meant to be permanent, only a delay until a more permanent solution could be found." Elias, who had been listening silently, now spoke. "My family's role was to monitor and reinforce when necessary. Small contributions of blood and memory during thin times, like reinforcing a dam with sandbags during a flood. But now the dam is breaking," Daniel observed, "because there's no Thorn bloodline to continue the watch," Emily concluded. "No one who knows the proper rituals." While they spoke, Marcus had moved to a corner of the tent where several artifacts had been collected. His hands found a cylindrical stone container they had recovered earlier, about the size of a thermos, carved from the same dark green material as the tablet, its surface covered in similar symbols, with deft movements that seemed guided by borrowed knowledge. He twisted the top section in a complex pattern. The container opened with a soft hiss, revealing a collection of thin sheets, not paper or parchment, but some unknown material with a texture like fine leather and a translucence that caught the light. "The complete record," Marcus said, his voice distant, "everything they knew about the entity." Sarah carefully removed the sheets, laying them out in a sequence only Marcus seemed to understand. Unlike the tablet's formal inscription, these contain detailed illustrations alongside the symbolic text, diagrams of the human mind, astronomical charts, and disturbing depictions of the entity itself. Though the drawings varied, they consistently portrayed the entity as a darkness with structure, a void with purpose and awareness, represented by intricate patterns of negative space within otherwise detailed scenes. They called it the void between thoughts, Sarah translated, following Marcus's guidance, a consciousness that exists in the spaces between minds, feeding on the energy of thought itself. That's why it affects our dreams and perceptions, Emily realized. It's not just trapped in the lake, it's trapped between our awareness of the lake and the lake itself. Daniel struggled to grasp the concept. "You're saying it's not physically in the water." "It's not physical at all," Marcus replied momentarily. "Lucid, not as we understand physical. It exists where consciousness intersects with reality, the boundary between mind and matter." Elias nodded. "The shamanic traditions speak of such spaces, where thought becomes thing and thing becomes thought. Emily, despite her scientific training, was beginning to accept the impossible logic of their situation. If conventional physics doesn't apply, then conventional solutions won't work either. As if responding to their growing understanding, the tent was suddenly illuminated by an intense flash from outside. They rushed to the entrance to find the lake transformed, the ice now completely clear except for the central fracture, which had widened into a dark chasm emitting pulsing blue light. Above the lake, the strange aerial phenomena had intensified, forming complex geometric patterns that mirrored the symbols on the tablet and scrolls. These patterns weren't just visual, they seemed to vibrate at frequencies that resonated painfully in their minds, like discordant music played directly into their thoughts. "It's breaking through," Elias gasped, clutching his chest as he struggled for breath. "The final barrier is failing." As they watched in horror, a column of water rose from the central chasm, not splashing or spraying, but moving with deliberate purpose, forming a twisting spiral that reached 20 feet into the air. Within this liquid column, shadows moved and shifted, occasionally resolving into almost human shapes before dissolving again. "The sacrificed," Marcus whispered. "They're still fighting to contain it." The water column collapsed suddenly, splashing back into the lake with unnatural force. The impact sent a shockwave across the ice, cracking what remained of the surface into fragments that began to drift apart like a broken mirror. "We need the ritual," Elias urged, his voice weakening. "The binding ceremony that can reinforce the containment." Sarah returned to the scrolls, searching for specific information. "There's a detailed description here, but—" She looked up, troubled. "It requires blood sacrifice from someone connected to this place. Someone with a bloodline link." All eyes turned to Elias, whose condition was visibly deteriorating. "I came prepared to be that sacrifice," the old shepherd admitted. "But I fear my life force may not be strong enough anymore. The cancer has taken too much of me." "There must be another way," Daniel insisted. Marcus, still operating with borrowed knowledge, turned to the final scroll, one covered in red symbols that seemed to shift and move when viewed directly. "There is," he said quietly, "but it requires someone else to take up the Guardian's mantle permanently, to bind their bloodline to this place for generations to come, as the thorns have been bound." The implication hung in the air, a commitment not just for one person, but for their descendants in perpetuity. Outside, the fragmented ice had begun to glow with an inner light, each piece becoming a floating lantern that illuminated the darkening valley. The entity was no longer merely breaking free, it was transforming its prison into a beacon. Night fell across Widow's Bowl with unnatural swiftness, as if darkness itself were eager to claim the valley. The team had retreated to their camp, forced back from the lake's edge by the increasingly unstable ice and the strange phenomena emanating from the water. Inside the main tent, they gathered around a battery-powered lantern, its artificial light somehow diminished by the pulsing glow that penetrated the fabric walls from outside. The artifacts they had collected, the tablet, mask, weatherstone, and cylindrical container with its ancient scrolls, were arranged in the center of their meeting. Each item, but he also recognized the fundamental violation in its approach. Not communion, but consumption. Not sharing, but taking. "I bind you," Daniel continued, his voice gaining strength as the ritual progressed. "Not in hatred, but in necessity. Not in fear, but in understanding." The temple began to shake, dust and small stones falling from the ceiling as the entity's resistance intensified. The pulsing light accelerated, becoming a stroboscopic flicker that disoriented and nauseated. Above, through the temple entrance, Daniel could see the ice of Widow's Bowl fracturing completely, the lake's surface churning, as if in a violent storm. Yet here in the chamber, everything remained eerily dry. The physical laws of the world above held at bay by forces he couldn't comprehend. As he spoke the final words of the binding, Daniel felt a sudden tug on his consciousness, not from the entity below, but from Emily above. Through whatever connection the ritual had established, he sensed her presence, her scientific mind struggling to process what was happening, while her emotional core reached out to him in concern and support. That connection gave him strength. Daniel completed the ritual phrase, pressing his bleeding palm directly against the bowl, which now glowed white-hot, though it caused him no pain. "It is done," he declared, to both the entity and himself. "The binding is renewed." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the bowl, mask, and amulet began to meld together, their separate forms dissolving into a single object, a disk of swirling energy that contained both light and darkness, physical matter and conscious thought. The entity made one final attempt to break free, sending a surge of psychic energy that threatened to shatter Daniel's mind. Images, emotions, and knowledge not meant for human comprehension battered against his consciousness like a storm against a lighthouse. Then, from above, he felt Emily's presence strengthen, her rational mind providing a framework that helped him organize and resist the chaotic assault. Through their connection, he sensed another presence joining them, Elias lending the weight of 7 generations of guardianship to the binding. Even Marcus's consciousness flickered briefly in the connection, the untainted human aspect of the Ranger contributing to the collective resistance against the entity's influence. The swirling disk on the altar contracted suddenly, condensing into a small, dense object that resembled a black stone carved with glowing symbols. The entity contained, once more, bound by freely given blood and conscious choice. As the binding completed, the pressure in the chamber released abruptly. The pulsing light faded, replaced by a steady, gentle illumination that emanated from the symbols carved into the columns. The violent shaking subsided, the temple once again still and silent. Daniel staggered, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. The ritual had taken more than blood. It had required psychic energy, attention and will that had left him drained to his core. He leaned heavily on Elias's staff, staring at the bound entity on the altar. According to the scrolls, the binding would hold for another cycle, decades of containment before the boundary would thin again, and another guardian would need to reinforce the seals. That guardian would be of his bloodline now. The ritual had created a connection that would pass to his descendants, a responsibility that would echo through generations yet unborn. As Daniel contemplated this legacy, water began to seep into the chamber, not in a violent rush, but in a controlled flow that suggested purpose rather than natural physics. The bound entity on the altar remained dry, protected by forces beyond comprehension. Understanding that the temple was returning to its natural state beneath the lake, Daniel carefully collected the bound entity, surprisingly light despite its dense appearance, and placed it in the pouch Emily had provided. With the staff to support his weakened body, he turned toward the staircase, ascending toward the world above and whatever consequences awaited. Spring sunlight dappled the surface of Widow's Bowl, the lake now serene and ordinary in appearance. 3 months had passed since the binding ritual. The ice had melted naturally with the changing seasons, revealing no sign of the underwater village or the extraordinary events that had transpired during those winter days. Daniel Morgan stood at the shore, a new walking stick in his hand, carved from lakeside wood by Elias before the old shepherd's passing 2 weeks prior. The staff bore subtle markings similar to its predecessor, symbols of guardianship and protection that would grow in power with years of vigilance. "I thought I'd find you here," Emily said, approaching from the trail behind him. "The memorial service is in 2 hours." Daniel nodded, his gaze still fixed on the placid water. "Just paying my respects first." Elias Thorne had died peacefully in his sleep, the cancer finally claiming him after he had held on long enough to pass his knowledge to the new guardians. His final months had been dedicated to teaching Daniel and Emily everything the Thorn family had accumulated over 7 generations of watching the lake. "How's Marcus?" Daniel asked as Emily joined him at the water's edge. "Better. The psychiatric team is calling it a complex dissociative episode, triggered by environmental factors." She smiled wryly. "Close enough to the truth, I suppose." Marcus Webb had recovered gradually after the binding, with no clear memory of his actions while under the entity's influence. His official medical leave cited extreme stress and hypothermia, with a transfer to administrative duties upon his return, far from Widow's Bowl and its hidden dangers. And Sarah? Still cataloguing artifacts at the university. The official report describes a previously unknown indigenous settlement of significant archaeological importance. Emily shook her head slightly. She's keeping the more unusual aspects out of academic publication, as promised. The world had received a carefully edited version of their discovery, a significant archaeological find, unfortunately damaged during spring thaw before complete documentation could be completed. The truly anomalous artifacts, including the bound entity, remained in the protection of the new guardians. "Your retirement ceremony is next week," Emily reminded him. "Have you decided?" Daniel ran his hand along the carved staff, feeling the subtle warmth of the wood responding to his touch. 30 years of service is enough. The forest will be in good hands with Jessica as chief ranger. What remained unspoken was the other responsibility he had assumed, the guardianship of widows. Bowl and the entity contained beneath its waters. That duty would require a different kind of vigilance, one not bound by federal employment or retirement plans. "I've accepted the research position at Montana State," Emily informed him. "It's only an hour's drive from here. Close enough for regular monitoring of the lake while maintaining my scientific career." Daniel smiled, recognizing the perfect balance she had found, honoring both her rational, scientific nature and the inexplicable responsibility they now shared. Like her mother, Emily had found a way to bridge seemingly incompatible worlds. "She would be proud of you," he said quietly. Emily's expression softened. "Of both of us, I think." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the afternoon light play across the lake's surface. Their relationship had been transformed by shared experience, the years of distance dissolved in the face of a common purpose and understanding. From his pocket, Daniel withdrew a small object wrapped in soft cloth. Unwrapping it carefully, he revealed the bound entity, now resembling a smooth stone amulet inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift subtly when viewed directly. "Elias said it should be returned to the lake periodically," he explained, "to maintain the connection between the guardian and the guarded." Together they waded into the shallows. Daniel held the amulet over the water, reciting the words Elias had taught him. Not the full binding ritual, but a simpler affirmation of vigilance and purpose. As the final syllable left his lips, he lowered the amulet into the lake. Rather than sinking immediately, it hovered just beneath the surface, emitting a soft glow visible even in daylight. Then, with purpose rather than mere gravity, it descended into the depths, returning to the temple that remained hidden from ordinary perception. "It's strange," Emily observed as they returned to shore. "Part of me, the scientist, still struggles to reconcile what we experienced with my understanding of physical reality." "And the other part?" Daniel asked. "The other part knows some truths exist beyond conventional explanation," she smiled. "Mom always said the most important things in life aren't subject to laboratory verification." As they turned to leave, Daniel cast one final glance at the lake. For a brief moment, he thought he saw patterns in the water, not random ripples but deliberate designs matching the symbols from the ancient scrolls. A reminder that beneath the ordinary surface, extraordinary things remained, waiting and watching. "Same time next month?" Emily asked, as they followed the trail back toward civilization. "Without fail," Daniel confirmed. "The boundary may be secure, but vigilance remains necessary." In his pocket, he carried a small journal, the first entry in what would become a new record of guardianship, to be passed down to future generations of Morgans as the Thorns had done before them. The first page contained a simple entry, dated the day of the binding ritual. "Today, I became a guardian of the boundary between worlds, not by choice at first, but now, by willing acceptance. What sleeps beneath the lake must remain there, not in fear, but in understanding of necessary separation. This responsibility I accept freely for myself and those who will come after me." As they crested the ridge, the lake disappearing from view behind them, a raven called from a nearby pine. The bird watched their departure with unusual intensity before taking flight, circling once over Widow's Bowl and then heading toward the distant mountains where other waters waited, placid on their surfaces, but perhaps not in their depths. In the pocket of his ranger jacket, Daniel felt a momentary warmth from the journal, a subtle reminder that some responsibilities, once accepted, never truly end. But as he glanced at his daughter walking beside him, he knew that such burdens were lighter when carried together across generations and understanding.